The pantry door was still open when I understood we had been wrong. Rook was pressed against the small, tailored coat with his blind muzzle buried in the wool, and he was not doing what a dog does when he recognizes a person. He was doing what a dog does when he finds a place he has been afraid of for months. Marcello was already halfway out the door with the coat over his arm, telling a captain to bring him every living Vieri under this roof, and I said the only word I could think of that would stop him. I said, "Marcello, wait!" He turned. The whole pantry turned with him, and in that same breath, from the doorway of the great hall, a young captain went white and said, "Boss, we cannot find Dante, and the two men who took Uncle Sal out through the kitchen never reached the secure room. The corridor cameras between the dining room and the wine cellar are dark. They have been dark for 11 minutes. Marcello did not move for a long second. I watched the color drain out of his face the way it drains out of a man who has already begun to count, in his head, how many doors in his own home he no longer trusts. His godfather had vanished between the dining table and a locked interior corridor 40 feet away. His security chief, the man who had put a car outside my grandmother's house and set up my motel in a false name and cloned Serafina's phone, was nowhere in the building. Somewhere above us, a captain was shouting orders that would not be obeyed by the men Dante had already turned. Somewhere below us, in a house whose walls I had walked for 3 weeks without knowing, a passage I had never seen was being used against us tonight. If your stomach just dropped along with mine, please tap that like button and stay with me, because everything you thought was solved at the end of part 1 is about to unravel in the next 20 minutes. Marcello reached for his phone. I laid my hand on his wrist before he could dial. "Look at Rook," I said. His eyes went to the dog. Rook had not lifted his head to follow Marcello out. Rook was still pressed to the coat, breathing in slow, deliberate pulls, the way a working animal reads a room he cannot see. I said very quietly, "He isn't smelling a person. He never was. He is smelling a place." Marcello opened his mouth to argue. Ottavia stepped past both of us and laid her hand flat on the wool. Her thin fingers stopped when they reached the collar. Her breath caught once, small and dry. "This is Serafina's," she said. Serafina, standing in the pantry doorway with her mascara ruined, said, "Mother, that isn't mine. I have never worn that coat in my life." Ottavia did not turn around. She said, "You were 8 years old. Your father had it made for the winter we spent at the boathouse. You wore it exactly 1 season and you outgrew it. The embroidery on the sleeve is not a family crest, Marcello. It is an S. Your sister was learning to sew that year. She stitched her own initial and cried when it came out crooked." Marcello lifted the sleeve to the pantry light. The letter, worn nearly smooth by 40 years of cedar and darkness, was an uneven S, not a lion, not an olive branch, a little girl's practice stitch. Marcello set the coat down on the shelf as though it were made of glass. He said, "Then who put it here?" Ottavia did not answer. Not yet. She stepped past him instead, walked the length of the pantry, and pressed her palm against a wall panel 3 feet to the left of where Rook had scratched. The panel gave. Behind it was not another compartment. Behind it was a doorway, narrow and low, with a set of stone steps falling away into darkness. The air that came up out of that stairwell was dry and old, and smelled of exactly 2 things: cedar and cloves. "This estate has 3 miles of servant passages your grandfather sealed off in 1962, Ottavia said, still not turning around. They were built with cedar planks to keep them dry, and every winter for 60 years, the housekeepers oiled the shelves inside them with clove oil to keep the moths out of the linen. Rook has not been smelling a coat, Marcello. He has not been smelling a man. He has been smelling every person who has recently walked through these passages, and the coat only carries the scent because it was stored down there for 40 years. Marla, she said without turning, tell my son the rest. He will believe it from you before he believes it from me. I understood then that Ottavia was doing something extraordinary in that pantry, and none of us in the room had caught up to it yet. I said, Marcello, every place Rook stopped in this house is a place these passages run behind. The library corridor, The wall outside your study. The kitchen. He stopped at the ballroom because whoever poured champagne on him had come from a passage that morning and still smelled of it. That is why the champagne was ordered, not to hurt him, to drown out the one scent that could still identify the person. Marcello said, Salvatore. I said, Salvatore used the passages, yes, but so did somebody else, and Rook was warning us about them the entire time. He looked at me. He said, Marla, say the name. I did not want to. I said it anyway. At the motel, I said. Rook sat up and pointed at the door 20 minutes before Dante's car pulled into the parking lot. I told myself it was because he recognized a protector. It wasn't. It was a warning. I said it, and my own words landed on me the way cold water lands on skin. All those long, quiet nights in the motel with Rook pointed at a door I thought was safe. All those cups of coffee poured by my grandmother for a young man Dante had personally chosen. Every kindness I had accepted in the last 3 weeks had been handed to me by the one person in that house who had never intended for me to survive it. Marcello closed his eyes for exactly 1 heartbeat, and when he opened them again, he was already a different man than the one who had walked into that pantry. He turned to the captain in the doorway. He said, Bring me the original gala recording. Not the file Dante gave us. The raw feed from the chandelier camera. The captain hesitated. Marcello did not raise his voice. He said, You will find it in the 3rd safe in my study. The one Dante does not have the combination to. Move. The captain ran. I have never before or since seen a man in a tuxedo run inside a mansion, but he ran that night because he had just watched his boss realize that his second-in-command had spent months feeding him a version of reality that had been edited before it reached his eyes. The chandelier recording played on the pantry laptop 3 minutes later. Marcello, Ottavia, Serafina, and I bent over the screen while Rook lay across my feet with his blind head cocked toward the sound. The footage began at the same place Dante's cut had begun, with the 3 men at the neighboring table lifting their glasses. But this version, the raw one, ran 20 seconds longer at the front. In those 20 seconds, a lean man in a dark security coat walked past the 3 men, laid one hand briefly on the shoulder of the tallest of the 3, and continued out of frame toward the kitchen doors. He did not look up. His face never turned to the camera, but we all knew the walk. Dante had been in that ballroom before Salvatore ever entered it. Dante had signaled the pour. And Dante, the man who had shown me his edited version of this same clip in a motel 4 days ago, had removed himself from the record. Before we go any further, if the size of this betrayal has just landed on you, drop a single word in the comments right now. Tell me whether you already suspected Dante, because I promise most of you did not. And I want you to remember that feeling when you hear what he was really planning. Marcello stood up. He walked to the pantry doorway. He looked down at the stone stairs and the cedar dark below them, and he said, without turning, he controlled the cameras. He controlled the motel. He controlled the fake voice Serafina thought was Uncle Sal. He controlled where my sister's phone rang and when it rang, and who was listening on the other end. He was investigating himself the entire time. Serafina made a small sound behind her hand. She said, The voice on the phone. It never used a name. I only assumed it was Uncle Sal because he was the one who used to call me when I was a girl. Ottavia said softly, He counted on that, my love. That is why he chose you. Serafina began to cry then, quietly, into the sleeve of her dress, and Ottavia put her hand on the back of her daughter's neck and held it there the way a mother holds a small child who has just understood what she has done. I did not have time to let her grieve. Neither did Marcello. I said, If Dante has taken Salvatore, he did not take him to hide him. Salvatore's job is not finished. Marcello said, Explain. I said, Think about how they built this. 2 possible outcomes tonight, and either one would have worked for them. If you had killed Serafina in front of your captains for the earring or the tablet, they would have shown the old guard a boss ruled by emotion. If you had protected me openly all along, they would have shown the old guard a boss ruled by an outsider. Every trap was a coin flip they could not lose. And when the dinner blew up in their faces and Salvatore was caught, they still had one card left, the old man himself. Marcello said, "Go on." I said, "Salvatore does not intend to survive tonight, Marcello. He intends to die, and he intends the body to look like your work." I let that sit for one breath. Then I said, "Kill a 76-year-old godfather who baptized you in front of a hidden witness in the boathouse where your father raised you, and every hardline captain in this organization will rise against you before the sun comes up. That is the coup. Not tonight's dinner, not the champagne. This." And Serafina was going to be the family witness whose testimony sealed it, whether she wanted to be or not. Serafina lifted her wet face at that. She did not argue. She had already understood. The pantry went silent. Rook lifted his head and pointed his blind face at the black stairwell. I understood, with the small, cold certainty a rehabilitation specialist learns to trust, that the dog had been asking us to follow him down those stairs since the moment we opened the panel. Marcello said, "The boathouse." Ottavia nodded once. She said, "Your father used those tunnels to move liquor during the war. They come out under the cliff. If Dante is taking Uncle Sal anywhere he wants a witness, he is taking him there." Marcello turned to me. He said, "Marla, go home. Take my mother and my sister. There will be a car in 15 minutes. I said, "No." He stopped. He had not expected the word, not from me, not tonight. I said, "Marcello, listen to me. If you walk into that boathouse alone, with your captains, willing to trade yourself for your mother and your sister and your empire, they will get exactly the ending they built. You need someone in that room who can watch the dog. You need someone in that room who does not owe her life to this family. And you need to stop deciding by yourself what happens to me. I am going. Rook is going. Because Rook is the only reliable way to know which of these 3 miles of passage Dante is using, and you know that as well as I do." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Bring the harness." We went down. A young captain named Toro, who had spent part 1 quietly driving me between the estate and Newburyport, took point with a flashlight. Marcello came second. I came third with Rook on the harness, his blind head lifted, his shoulders working steadily along the stones. Ottavia came fourth on Serafina's arm. 2 more of Marcello's men fell in behind. The passage sloped down and then leveled out and then sloped again. The cedar smell thickened until it was almost sweet. At every branching, Rook chose one direction without hesitation, and every time he chose, Toro flicked the beam of his flashlight ahead and found, on the dust of the flagstones, the faint drag mark of 2 sets of shoes. One walking, one being helped along. Dante was ahead of us. Salvatore was still alive. The passages had not been walked openly in 60 years, and yet the cedar planks along the walls were oiled and dark, and the stone underfoot had been swept clean in long, deliberate strokes. Someone had been keeping this hidden network alive. Toro whispered over his shoulder that the sconces set into the stone were newer than the walls, wired for modern current, spaced exactly the way a security man would space them if he wanted the light steady and the shadows short. Marcello did not answer him. He did not need to. Every step we took was another sentence in the story Dante had been writing under this house for years, and Marcello was reading it now for the first time. His jaw worked once. His shoulders stayed level. And Rook, ahead of us in the harness, kept his blind head high, choosing the path with the calm certainty of a working dog who has finally been asked, out loud, the question he had been trying to answer since the night a bottle of champagne was poured into his eyes. We had walked for perhaps 12 minutes when Serafina began to speak, very softly, so that only Ottavia and I could hear her. She said, "I thought he wanted me to lead. That was the story he told me on the phone. The voice I thought was Uncle Sal. He said Marcello had grown soft and the family needed a Vieri woman ready to steady the captains when the old guard moved. He said my son would be safe because he needed me. He said I was the only one who could keep the family from breaking." Ottavia squeezed her daughter's arm. She said, "He was never going to let you lead anything, Serafina. He needed you as a witness. He needed a Vieri in a black dress swearing to the captains that her brother had lost himself because of Marla. That was your only assignment. Everything else was flattery. Serafina did not answer, but her back straightened as she walked, and when the passage opened suddenly into a wider stone chamber with the smell of salt and rope in the air, she was the first of us to step through the doorway with Marcello. The Vieri boathouse was older than the estate. It sat inside the sea cliff on a shelf of black rock, with double doors that opened onto a stone slip where, 90 years ago, small boats had run whiskey in from waiting freighters. It smelled of tar and cedar and the cold Atlantic, and in the center of it, under a single bulb, Salvatore Corleone was sitting in a wooden chair with his cashmere coat draped across his knees and a small glass of red wine in his hand. He was not tied. He was not gagged. He was smiling. Dante stood behind him, not near him, behind him, far enough away that no camera on any hidden phone could ever show the two of them touching. He had a pistol loose in his right hand, the barrel pointed at the stone floor. He had prepared this room like a stage. 2 folding chairs to one side, a small tripod, a phone already recording. And on the workbench along the far wall, arranged in the careful way a man arranges evidence, were 3 items I recognized. Marcello's silver lighter, taken from his study, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a black leather glove. Every piece of it was going to end up in Salvatore's blood before the night was over. Salvatore lifted his glass to Marcello without standing. He said, "So you brought the dog woman. I told him you would. Dante bet me 20,000 you would come alone." Marcello did not answer. Salvatore said, "Sit down, godson. Have a drink with an old man. This is the last time we will share a bottle, and I would like you to remember it." Marcello did not sit. Salvatore said, "You disappointed your father tonight, you know. He would have burned my body in the courtyard by now. He would have made an example of me in front of the captains. Instead, you locked doors and asked questions, and let a woman with a blind dog explain your own family to you. You are not the man he built." He said it gently, almost sadly, the way a teacher speaks to a student who has failed a subject he was expected to master. Marcello said, "Uncle Sal, stop." Salvatore did not stop. He said, "Your wife would be ashamed of you. Do you know what she said to me the week before she died? She said, 'Promise me he does not go soft when I am gone.' And you have. You have, Marcello. You have gone soft, and this dog woman is proof of it. And there is only one way tonight ends that gives the family back to men who remember what your father was." He set the wine glass down on the arm of the chair. He said, "So do it. Do what he would have done. There are 5 witnesses in this room. Let them see you finish it." I watched Marcello's hand hover 1 inch from the grip of his pistol, and I watched his eyes do a thing I had never seen a Vieri do. They went wet. I did not move. I did not speak. This was not my moment. Rook, on the harness beside me, was pointed directly at Dante with the same rigid stillness he had shown against Salvatore's cashmere hem, and I understood that the dog was telling me who the danger in this room actually was. Serafina, behind us, took 1 step forward and stopped. Ottavia did not step forward. Ottavia stood exactly where she had told me she would stand 3 weeks earlier in a kennel with her hand as thin as writing paper, where her son needed her to stand, not where anyone wanted her to stand. Marcello said, "You want me to kill you." His voice was very low. Salvatore said, "I want you to be the man your father made you. If that is the same thing, then yes." Marcello said, "It was you and Dante all along, the 2 of you." Salvatore inclined his head. "I gave him the philosophy," he said. "He gave me the mechanism. Together we could have restored something you never understood, godson. Together we still can. All you have to do is what any Vieri man would have done an hour ago in the pantry." Marcello lifted the pistol, not high. He lifted it to his hip and left it there, and for a full second I thought he was going to give the old man exactly what he had come here to receive. Then he did the most dangerous thing he has ever done in his life. He lowered the pistol. He set it on the workbench next to the lighter and the handkerchief and the glove. He turned to Toro. He said, "Take Salvatore alive. He will spend the rest of his life in a room I choose. He will not speak. He will not be photographed. He will not be visited. He will simply exist until nobody in this organization remembers his name. That is worse than a bullet, and he knows it. Salvatore's face changed then. For the first time all night, the smile fell off him. He said, "Marcello." Marcello said, "You do not get to be a martyr, Uncle Sal. You do not get a funeral my captains cry at. You do not get a legend. You get a small room and a long silence, and when you die in it, no one will notice." I watched a 76-year-old man understand, in real time, that his final move had failed. His hands began to shake. Behind him, Dante moved. It was very small and very fast. He had listened to Marcello's sentence the way a chess player listens to a move that erases an opening he had prepared for years, and the calm went out of him in an instant. His pistol came up from the floor in a single, practiced arc, not toward Salvatore, but toward the center of Marcello's chest. I opened my mouth to shout, and I was not the fastest person in the room. Serafina was. Serafina had been standing 3 steps behind her brother. She was not trained. She had never held a weapon in her life. But she was the sister of a mafia boss and the daughter of another one, and she had spent 46 years watching men in her family read a room. She saw Dante's shoulder drop before his hand finished moving. She threw herself into the space between them. She did not grab the pistol. She grabbed his elbow, hard, the way a woman grabs a child about to walk into traffic. And she drove it up and to the left with the whole weight of her body. The shot went into the cedar rafters. Splinters rained down. Toro and 2 of Marcello's men were on Dante before he could pull the trigger a second time. They put him face down on the stone floor. Serafina stood over him with her hand still on his sleeve, breathing hard, tears running down her face, and she said quietly to the top of his head, "You told me my son was in danger. From my own brother. You told me that." Dante did not answer her. He did not look up. He had understood, the way old men understand and young generals sometimes never do, that the room he had built no longer belonged to him. Marcello stepped past him without looking down. He walked to his sister. He did not thank her either. He put his hand on the back of her head, the way Ottavia had put her hand on the back of Serafina's neck an hour before in the pantry, and he pressed his forehead once against her temple. Then he turned to me. He said, "Marla." I said, "I am here." He said, "You were right about the room." We did not drive back to the estate. We walked back through the passages, because Marcello wanted his mother out of the sea air, and because he did not want Salvatore or Dante out through the cliff door, where any of Dante's remaining people might be waiting. Toro and the captains brought both men behind us in silence. Rook led the whole procession the way he had led us down, blind head up, harness steady, choosing every branching without hesitation. Ottavia walked on my arm. She was very light. She was very calm. She said once, when we were about halfway back, "That was well done, dear, both of you." I did not understand yet what she was really saying. I would. I heard her voice change slightly on the word both, the way a mother's voice changes when she is quietly thanking a stranger who has just carried her son through a burning room. I filed that away with all the other small things about Ottavia I had begun to notice and had not yet learned to read. Behind us, Serafina walked in silence with her arm through Toro's, her mother's daughter for the first time in a very long time. And ahead of us, Marcello did not look back once. He did not need to. He had already understood that every person he loved had walked into the boathouse with him, and every one of them was walking out. At the estate, the compromised captains were separated one by one in the front courtyard and driven off in different cars. Dante was taken to a windowless room in the old wing. Salvatore was taken to a different windowless room in a different old wing. Neither of them would see the other again. Marcello sent a short message to every senior man in the organization, and by dawn the story was already changing in the way stories change when a boss decides they will. No martyr, no civil war, no hidden Vieri traitor. Just an old godfather who had reached too far, and a security chief who had believed his own map of the house. If you stayed with us through the boathouse, hit that subscribe button for me now, because there is one last piece to this. and I promise it is going to reorganize everything you thought you understood about the woman who has been sitting quietly at the head of that dining table all night." Marcello came looking for me at the kennel just before sunrise. Rook was already asleep with his blind head on my knee. Marcello sat down on the wooden bench beside me and did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "I still cannot explain one thing, Marla. If Dante controlled the passages, and Dante has controlled them for months, then who took Serafina's coat out of storage and put it behind the pantry panel where Rook could find it? Because it was not there a week ago. Toro walked that pantry last Wednesday for a fire inspection. He would have noticed. Somebody placed that coat during dinner." I looked up. I had not thought of that. My stomach did the small, cold thing it had done in the pantry. From the doorway of the kennel, in a house robe and slippers, holding 2 cups of tea, Ottavia said, "I did." She came in and sat down across from us and handed us each a cup. Her hands were perfectly steady. She said, "I have known about the passages since I was a bride in this house. Nobody told me. My mother-in-law showed me the summer before she died, because she said no Vieri woman should live inside these walls without knowing where the walls were hollow. I did not think about them for 50 years. And then, about 6 months ago, I began to notice something on Dante." She lifted her tea with both hands. She said, "He came out of your study one night smelling of cedar, and there was no cedar in your study. He came in from a drive smelling of cloves, and he had not eaten. I did not know what it meant at first. I did not want it to mean what it meant. But he was your father's godson's protege, Marcello. He learned everything he knew about this family from Salvatore. And Salvatore had begun to look at you the way your father used to look at men he was already planning to remove." Marcello set his tea down. His hand was not steady. Ottavia went on. She said, "I could not accuse him. He controlled the security. He read my phone. He knew every person I spoke to. If I had told you what I suspected without proof, he would have known within the hour, and he would have moved against you before you were ready. So I did the only thing an 80-year-old woman with no weapons and no authority can do. I waited. I watched. And when Marla came into this house and I saw the way that dog behaved around her, I understood that Rook was already trying to tell you the same thing I could not." She smiled at me, small and dry. She said, "So during the reconciliation dinner, while Dante was busy at the front door directing his captains, I walked through the old cedar closet in my dressing room, opened the passage inside it, took Serafina's childhood coat off its hook where it has hung since 1979, and placed it behind the pantry panel I knew Rook would sooner or later scratch. I could not tell you what to look for. I had to let the dog find it for you. I had to trust that Marla would not let you draw the wrong conclusion from it." She folded her thin hands in her lap. She said, "I have watched a great many men in this family, Marcello. Your father, your uncles, your captains, and now Dante. Every one of them believed, at some point, that because I did not raise my voice at their table, I did not hear what was being said at it. That is an old woman's greatest advantage, and I have used it exactly twice in 60 years. The first time was the winter your father tried to send Serafina to a boarding school she did not want. This is the second." Serafina, standing behind her in the kennel doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. Ottavia did not turn. She said, "I did not know how it would end, Marcello. I only knew that if I did nothing, it would end with a funeral in this house, and it would not be Dante's. So I moved the one piece Dante had forgotten to guard, a coat a little girl outgrew in 1979. That was the whole of it. The rest was Rook and Marla and you." I could not speak. Marcello could not speak either, not for a long moment. Then he said very softly, "Mother." Ottavia said, "Do not scold me, Marcello. I am too old to be scolded." She sipped her tea. She said, "Salvatore was manipulating your sister. Dante was manipulating Salvatore's operation. You and Marla were manipulating both of them. I was simply making sure that if all 3 of you missed the smallest piece, my dog would not." She looked down at Rook, who had opened his blind eyes at the sound of her voice and thumped his tail once against the wooden floor. She said, "He is a very good dog, Marcello. Your wife chose well. And that, more than anything else that had happened in the boathouse or the pantry or the ballroom, was the sentence that finally undid her son. He did not cry. Marcello Vieri does not cry. But he pressed his fingers over his eyes for a long moment, and when he took them away he looked, for the first time since I had met him, like a man who no longer had to carry the entire weight of his family alone. He said, "Marla." I said, "Marcello." He said, "I am not going to ask you to move into this house. That was the wrong offer 3 weeks ago, and it is still the wrong offer tonight." I set my tea down. He said, "You have a clinic in Newburyport, and a grandmother who makes coffee for security men in her kitchen. And if I try to fold you into this estate the way my father folded my mother, I will lose the exact thing about you that made me trust you in the first place." I said, "What are you asking then?" He said, "I am asking to drive up on Sundays. I am asking whether Dolores would let me sit at her table again. I am asking whether Rook can sleep under it. I am asking, Marla, to be allowed into the small life you built without expecting you to leave it." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my grandmother's hands. I thought about the boat shed roof I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I thought about a blind dog who had trusted me on a marble ballroom floor before he had any reason to. And I understood that a man who asks to be let in on those terms is a man who has already decided he will not confuse loving you with owning you. I did not say yes with my mouth. I said yes by not letting go of his hand for the length of that sunrise. Rook rolled onto his side and pushed his blind face against Marcello's shoe. Ottavia finished her tea. Somewhere on the far side of the estate, a door opened, and a captain called a name, and the ordinary morning of a very unordinary house began again. And on the small wooden bench in the kennel, in the first gray light off the sea, Marcello Vieri, who had ordered a ballroom sealed for a blind dog 3 months earlier, took the second breath of his second life. He did not need to say it out loud. Neither did I. Salvatore Corleone lived out his remaining years in a quiet room in a quiet wing of the estate. He was not tortured. He was not photographed. He was not permitted a single visitor. He died 4 years later of something ordinary, and no captain came to his funeral because no funeral was held. Dante Russo was stripped of every asset and every contact and every scrap of authority he had built inside the organization, and he was moved to a small town far from the sea where he lived under a name that was not his, watched at all times by men he had once trained. Marcello dismantled the entire single chief security structure Dante had built and replaced it with 3 separate people who reported to him independently, so that no one man could ever again decide what he saw and what he did not. Serafina began the long work of earning back what she had cost. She apologized to me one afternoon on the seawall, without excuses and without asking for anything back, and I told her that forgiveness was not a thing I owned to give, only a road I could walk with her if she was willing to walk it slowly. Her mother did not rush that work. Neither did I. Neither did Marcello. Forgiveness in that family was not a gift you handed out. It was a road you walked. I kept my clinic in Newburyport. I kept the boat shed with the leaking roof and the 2 rescue mutts who slept in the office and the small waiting room with a pine bench my grandfather had built. Marcello drove up on Sundays, then Fridays, then eventually most evenings if the weather was clear. Dolores took to setting a 3rd plate at the kitchen table without asking. Rook slept under it. She made him coffee once and then remembered dogs do not drink coffee. And Marcello laughed for the first time I had ever heard him laugh out loud, and that laugh, more than any oath or any promise, was the sound I understood I had fallen in love with all the way back on a marble ballroom floor. He never asked me to leave the shed. I never asked him to leave the estate. We built the 3rd thing between us, on a small kitchen table in a small coastal town, and Ottavia, when she finally came up to visit that spring, walked into my grandmother's kitchen and said only, "Yes, this is right." She sat down at the table and asked Dolores where she had bought her curtains, and the 2 women, born 40 miles and 1 entire world apart, spent the whole afternoon talking about fabric while their children washed the dishes in silence. If you stayed with us all the way to Dolores's kitchen table, do me one last favor before you go. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments which of the 3 quiet games in this story surprised you the most. Salvatore's philosophy, Dante's mechanism, or an 80-year-old mother sitting silently at the head of a dining table who understood the board before any of us did. I know which one I am still thinking about tonight. Rook is asleep under the kitchen table. Marcello is washing the dishes. Dolores is humming to the radio. And on the counter, in a small white cup, there is a fresh sprig of clove from the garden. Otavia sent it up yesterday. She said it was for the pantry. She said every good house should keep the moths out of the linen. The end. This time, all the way.